In June 1944, while Allied forces stormed Normandy's beaches, 50 black sailors on a California naval base made a decision that would trigger the U.S. Navy's largest mutiny trial in history, a stand that could have cost them their lives, but would ultimately crack open the Navy's racist armor. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which help shape the history of the world that we are living in. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. Help me show her that real-life stories like this matter and deserve to be heard by liking the video. Where you're watching from, share it with someone, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Port Chicago Naval Magazine sat on the southern shore of Sassoon Bay, about 30 miles northeast of San Francisco. On the night of July 17, 1944, the facility was a hive of activity. Two cargo ships, the SSEA Bryan and SS Quinault Victory, were being loaded with 4,606 tons of explosives and incendiary bombs destined for the Pacific Theater. At 10:18 p.m., a blinding flash tore through the night. The EA Bryan disintegrated in a massive explosion that registered as a 3.4 magnitude earthquake. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows 20 miles away and created a mushroom cloud visible for miles. When the smoke cleared, 320 men were dead. 202 of them were black enlisted sailors. Another 390 were injured. It was the deadliest home front disaster of World War II. Here's what most people don't know. Every single man loading those ships was black. The officers supervising them were white. This wasn't a coincidence, it was policy. The Navy in 1944 was deeply segregated. Black sailors were relegated to the most menial and dangerous jobs. They worked as stewards serving white officers their meals, or as ammunition handlers. They couldn't become gunners, pilots, or officers. At Port Chicago, black sailors worked 24-hour shifts loading live ammunition onto ships bound for combat zones. They received no training in handling explosives. None. Instead, their white officers turned the deadly work into a competition, pitting divisions against each other to see who could load faster. Tonnage was recorded. Winners got extra liberty. The faster they worked, the greater the danger, but complaining could earn you a court-martial. 3 weeks after the explosion, the Navy ordered the surviving sailors back to work. They were to resume loading ammunition ships at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, just across the bay. No investigation into the cause had been completed. No new safety procedures had been implemented. Nothing had changed except that 320 of their friends were dead. On August 9, 1944, when ordered to load ammunition, 258 black sailors refused. Their commander, Captain Merrill T. Kinney, assembled them and gave a speech. He told them they were shirking their duty. He warned them that mutiny in wartime could carry the death penalty. He gave them a chance to reconsider. Most did. Fear, military discipline, and patriotism brought 208 men back into line. But 50 sailors stood firm. Among them was Seaman First Class Joe Small, a charismatic 23-year-old who had survived the Port Chicago blast. The Navy charged all 50 men with mutiny, the most serious charge in military law. If convicted, they could be executed by firing squad. The trial began on September 14, 1944, at Treasure Island Naval Base. It was the largest mass mutiny trial in U.S. naval history. The proceedings exposed the Navy's systemic racism to public scrutiny for the first time. Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP's chief counsel, who would later become the first black Supreme Court justice, attended the trial and investigated the conditions at Port Chicago. He wrote scathingly about what he found. This is not an individual case of 50 men being tried. Is the Navy on trial? The prosecution argued that the men had conspired together to refuse orders, but the defense revealed a different truth. These men hadn't conspired. They had individually reached the same conclusion, that returning to work under the same deadly conditions that had killed 202 of their brothers was suicide, not duty. The testimonies painted a devastating picture. Sailors described being forced to load ammunition without training, without proper equipment, without basic safety protocols. They described working under officers who cared more about tonnage records than their lives. They described watching the competition between divisions grow more reckless as officers pushed for faster loading times. One sailor testified that he had asked for training in handling ammunition. He was told he didn't need any, just to do what he was told. On October 24, 1944, after just 80 minutes of deliberation, the court-martial board convicted all 50 men of mutiny. They were sentenced to 15 years of hard labor and dishonorably discharged. Joe Small, identified as a ringleader, initially faced harsher charges but received the same sentence. The convictions sent shockwaves through black communities nationwide. Civil rights organizations rallied. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to the Navy expressing her concerns about the case. The public pressure was mounting, but the men remained imprisoned at Terminal Island in San Pedro, California. The Navy conducted an investigation into the Port Chicago explosion, but the findings were inconclusive. They couldn't determine the exact cause. Theories ranged from rough handling of ordnance to sabotage, but one thing was clear. The lack of training and the pressure to load ammunition at breakneck speeds had created a catastrophe waiting to happen. The long road to justice. In January 1946, after the war ended, the Navy reduced the sentences. The men were released from prison, but not exonerated. They carried dishonorable discharges that would haunt them for decades, limiting their job prospects, denying them veterans' benefits, marking them as criminals in the eyes of society. But the Port Chicago 50 had accomplished something profound. Their stand and the publicity surrounding their trial contributed to growing pressure on the military to desegregate. In July 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces. The order specifically cited the need to ensure equality of treatment regardless of race. The Navy was among the last branches to fully comply, dragging its feet for years. But the change was irreversible. For decades, the Port Chicago 50 lived in obscurity, their convictions standing as official history. Joe Small worked odd jobs in New Jersey. Other survivors scattered across the country, carrying the weight of their mutiny convictions in silence. It wasn't until 1994, 50 years after the explosion, that Congress authorized a memorial at the Port Chicago site. In 1999, President Bill Clinton pardoned Freddie Meeks, one of the 50 shortly before his death, but it was only a single pardon. The other 49 remained convicted mutineers in the eyes of history. The survivors and their advocates continued pushing for full exoneration. In 2019, a bipartisan group of California lawmakers introduced legislation to exonerate all 50 men. As of now, that full exoneration has not been granted by Congress, though public support continues to grow. Do you think the American civil society should start advocating again for their exoneration? Drop your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.